The cry echoed through the canyon like the wail of a ghost. It was faint at first, bouncing off the stone walls and swallowed by the jungle's heavy night air, but then it came again sharper, rawer, undeniably human. The warrior froze where? He stood among the tangled roots and dripping ferns, his hand tightening on the strap of the satchel slung across his chest. He had not heard such a sound in years, not since the night he buried his spear and vowed never again to fight. But that cry, it tore through him, awakened something he had tried to kill long ago. The jungle breathed around him, alive with the hiss of insects and the distant growl of unseen beasts. Vines dangled like serpents from the cliff above, and somewhere in the dark, water dripped steadily into hidden pools. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of moss, smoke, and old secrets. And cutting through it all, another cry-horse. Broken, full of terror, his legs carried him before his mind decided. The ground grew uneven, rocks slick beneath his bare feet. The cries led him to a gaping maw in the cliffside, a cave mouth blacker than the sky above. He had passed this cave many times in his solitude, always refusing to look inside, as if the shadows themselves knew his name. But tonight the cave called him, and what he saw inside made his heart thunder like the drums of war. 2 women, bound at the wrists and ankles with thick, coarse rope, were being dragged deeper into the cavern by faceless shadows. Their muffled screams reverberated against the stone, rising and falling with every desperate struggle. The flicker of torches cast grotesque shapes on the cave walls, swallowing the women in a moving sea of darkness. The warrior pressed himself against the rock, his breath ragged. The sight clawed at him, tearing open scars he had tried to bury. Years ago, he had fought in battles that left rivers of blood in their wake. He had seen women and children bound the same way, helpless, voiceless, carried off by men who believed cruelty was power. Back then, he had fought. Back then, his spear had sung in the night, but he had buried that man. He had sworn never to raise his hand again, never to let violence define him. Yet here it was again, the same cruelty, the same helpless cries. Jungle seemed to lean closer, pressing in on him, demanding his choice. He could turn away, let the darkness swallow them. They were strangers. Their fate did not belong to him. He had walked this path of solitude for years, surviving only by avoiding the struggles of others. But then, one of the women turned her head. The torchlight fell across her face, her eyes wide with terror, her lips raw from the gag pressed against them. For a fleeting second, their eyes met across the cavern floor, and in her gaze he saw not just fear, but the silent plea of a soul begging not to be forgotten. Something inside him cracked out, his fingers curled into fists, his chest burned, not with fear, but with a memory, a time when his arms were strong, when his spirit was fierce, when his spear was more than a weapon. It had been part of him, an extension of his very breath. He had buried it beneath the earth to silence the past, but in that moment he felt it again, the weight of it in his hands, the power it had given him. The cries echoed deeper into the cave as the shadows dragged the women further inside. Their bound forms scraped over stone, swallowed by darkness, their fate inching closer to the unknown. The warrior stood trembling at the cave's mouth, torn between the man he had sworn to become and the one he used to be. His heart pounded like war drums, his breath shallow, his body coiled tight with an energy he thought he had killed. And then he stepped forward. The cool breath of the cave washed over him, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, smoke, and fear. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of destiny. With every footfall, the weight of his buried spear pressed harder against his soul, reminding him that some weapons were never truly laid to rest. For years he had told himself he was no longer a warrior. But tonight, the jungle whispered otherwise. Tonight, The cries of strangers had reached the grave he had dug for himself, and the man buried within was stirring. The warrior inhaled deeply, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows ahead. He had not wanted this fight. He had not sought it. But fate, like the jungle, cared nothing for promises, and so, with the echoes of bound cries pulling him deeper into the darkness, the warrior crossed the threshold of the cave, and into the past he had tried to forget. The jungle swallowed the sound of his footsteps as the warrior slipped inside the cave. The air shifted instantly cool, damp, and heavy with the musk of earth and smoke. Shadows leapt across the stone walls, cast by torches wedged between rocks, their flames sputtering in the draught. The cries had grown weaker, muffled by cloth and fear, but they still echoed, guiding him deeper. He moved like a panther, silent, muscles coiled with every step. For years he had hidden himself away, living off roots and rainwater, keeping to the edge of life. But now, with every heartbeat, he felt his past stirring. The man who had buried his spear had been a ghost. The man who followed these cries was something else. The cave opened wider ahead. He pressed himself against the wall, breath steady, eyes narrowing. From the shadows he saw them, the two women bound and forced to their knees on the cold stone floor. Their dresses were torn. From the struggle, ropes biting into their wrists and ankles. Their wide, terrified eyes flickered in the firelight. Around them stood three men, strangers to him but carrying the stench of cruelty he knew too well. Their faces were hidden in shadow, broad-brimmed hats pulled low, pistols and knives glinting at their belts. One of them laughed, the sound coarse and cruel, as he nudged one of the women's shoulders with the toe of his boot. "Didn't think we'd catch two at once," the man sneered. "Boss'll be pleased." The warrior's jaw tightened. He didn't know who this boss was, but he didn't need to. The intent was written in their actions, carved into the fear on the women's faces. These men were not rescuers. They were hunters. His hand twitched at his side, instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The spear he had buried. Miles away, the one he swore he would never raise again, it haunted him now. But even without it, he knew his body could be a weapon. The jungle had kept him lean, strong, sharp. His fists, his strength, his will, they had been dormant, but not destroyed. One of the women whimpered against her gag, her shoulders trembling. The warrior's chest tightened. He could almost hear his mother's voice from years ago, telling him that silence in the face of cruelty was the same as betrayal. He had betrayed himself once by walking away from war, by burying the part of him that fought for others. But he would not betray these women. He stepped forward. The scrape of his foot against stone was soft, but it cut through the cavern like thunder. The three men whipped their heads around, eyes narrowing against the shadows. For a moment, all was still. Then the warrior emerged into the firelight. His figure was carved with muscle, chest bare, bronzed skin gleaming with sweat, long black, hair falling across his shoulders. Bone and turquoise jewelry glimmered faintly in the torchlight, relics of a past he had buried but never abandoned. His eyes burned, not with rage, but with an ancient, unshakable resolve. "Who's there?" One of the men barked, hand flying to the pistol at his hip. The warrior did not answer. His silence was louder than any words, his presence heavier than any threat. The women's eyes locked on him, wide, desperate, shimmering with hope they hadn't dared believe in. One of the captors sneered. "Another stray," he muttered, drawing his blade. Easy enough to deal with. They didn't understand. This was no stray. This was no lost wanderer stumbling into their lair. This was a man who had once been a storm, who had once painted battlefields red, who had once carried the weight of his people's survival in his hands. He had buried that man, yes, but the cries had unearthed him. The warrior's muscles coiled. He felt the blood thrum through his veins, the old rhythm of battle that had never truly left. The torchlight flickered across his body, shadows and flame shaping him into something more than human, something elemental, inevitable. The cave seemed to hold its breath. The women stopped struggling, their eyes fixed on him as though willing him to act. The three men bristled, weapons ready, but doubt flickered in their eyes. They saw something in him that unsettled them, though they couldn't name it. And then, with the sound of a panther breaking from cover, the warrior moved. The cave seemed to freeze in the moment before chaos. Torchlight flickered, stretching the shadows across jagged stone. The three men stood rigid, hands on their weapons, uncertain whether to laugh at the shirtless stranger or fear him. The women, bound on the floor, trembled, their eyes locked on the warrior, silently pleading. The warrior's body was still, his breathing steady, but inside his chest his heart thundered like hooves across dry earth. He had promised himself he would never fight again. He had sworn his hands would never take another life. Yet, as he stood in the glow of fire, the cries of the women still echoing in his ears, he knew some vows could not survive the weight of injustice. The first man sneered, stepping forward with his blade raised. "You chose the wrong cave to wander into, savage." The word cut deeper than the steel he carried. But the warrior did not flinch. He had been called worse by enemies who underestimated him until their blood watered the earth. The man lunged. Warrior moved like lightning, his bare feet gripping the stone, his hand snapping out to seize the man's wrist. With a twist born of instinct and years of forgotten battles, the blade clattered against the floor. Before the man could react, the warrior's elbow crashed into his jaw. Bone cracked, and the attacker crumpled against the rock with a groan, his body sprawling across the ground. The second captor cursed, yanking a pistol from his belt. The torchlight gleamed along its barrel as he raised it. The women screamed behind their gags, but the warrior had already closed the distance. He slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him staggering against the cave wall. The gun fired, the shot deafening in the tight cavern, sparks showering stone instead of flesh. The warrior's fist drove into the man's ribs once, twice, each blow powered by years of rage he had buried beneath silence. The pistol fell, sliding across the floor into the darkness. The third man hesitated, his knife trembling in his hand. He had seen enough to understand this was no ordinary opponent. Sweat shone on his brow, his boots scraping backward against the rock. "Stay back," he barked, though his voice wavered. "I'll gut them if you come any closer." He dragged one of the women upright by the ropes around her arms, pressing the knife to her throat. Her muffled cry broke through the gag, her eyes wide with terror. The other woman sobbed helplessly beside her. The warrior froze, chest heaving, sweat and blood streaking his skin. His muscles trembled with the need to strike, but he forced himself to stillness. Every instinct screamed at him to leap forward, to tear the knife away, but he had seen death delivered too swiftly before. One wrong move and the cave floor would drink her blood. "Drop it," the man growled, the knife pressing closer against the woman's pale skin. "Whoever you are, you've already made your mistake. Walk away, or I'll make sure she doesn't breathe another second." The cave was silent but for the crackle of torches and the heavy breathing of men and captives alike. Time stretched thin, taut as a bowstring. The warrior's eyes locked on the woman's. She was trembling, but she held his gaze. She wasn't begging. She wasn't surrendering. In her eyes was the same plea he had seen at the cave's mouth. "Don't. Let this end here." The warrior inhaled slowly, his body lowering slightly, the way a predator lowers before the strike. His voice, when it came, was calm, deep, steady as stone. "Let her go," he said. The captor laughed bitterly. "Or what? You'll kill me?" The warrior's eyes narrowed. "No, I will end you." The silence cracked. The knife-wielding man's resolve faltered for just a heartbeat long enough. The warrior's hand shot out, quicker than the flicker of the torchlight. A shard of stone, sharp as broken glass, flew from his grip. It struck the man's wrist with brutal precision. He yelped, his knife clattering to the floor. The bound woman collapsed forward, scrambling free of his grasp. In the same breath, the warrior closed the distance. His fist hammered into the man's chest, driving him back into the rock wall. The impact shook dust loose from the ceiling, echoing like thunder. Another blow to the temple sent the man collapsing unconscious to the ground. The cave was still again, except for the labored breathing of the women and the warrior. The three men lay sprawled across the floor, broken and beaten, their threat ended. The warrior knelt, his fingers working quickly at the ropes that bound the captives. The rough fiber bit into his calloused hands, but he didn't stop until the first woman's wrists were free. She tore the gag from her mouth, gasping, her voice hoarse. You saved us," she whispered. The warrior didn't respond. His chest heaved, his skin slick with sweat and blood, but his eyes burned with something deeper than triumph or resurrection. He had buried his past, buried his spear, buried the man who once fought for the helpless. But the cries in this cave had unearthed him, and he knew, with bone-deep certainty, that whoever had ordered these women bound and dragged into the dark would not stop here. This was only the beginning. The cave had fallen silent, save for the crackle of torches and the ragged breathing of the women. Their bonds lay in tatters at their feet, the coarse ropes cut loose by the warrior's hands. The three men who had dragged them inside now sprawled, unconscious across the stone, their groans fading into stillness. But silence in a jungle cave was never a blessing. The warrior's eyes scanned the shadows, his instincts sharp. He had fought enough battles to know when danger lingered beyond. The first clash. The women clutched one another, their eyes darting to the deeper tunnels that branched away into blackness. From those depths came faint sounds, boots striking stone, the faint scrape of metal, hushed voices carrying through the cavern air. The warrior's chest tightened, reinforcements. The women looked to him, their voices hoarse with fear. "Please." One whispered, her hands trembling as she touched his arm. "They'll come back. There are more. So many more." The other nodded frantically. "This is just one chamber. They keep others deeper inside. If we don't leave now, we'll be trapped." Her words struck like a blade. Others, more captives. The warrior's heart pounded. He could take these two and vanish into the jungle, slip back into the shadows as he had done for years. But he knew what it meant to be left behind. He knew. The sound of rope cutting into flesh, of muffled screams lost to stone walls. If he walked away, the faces of those unseen prisoners would haunt him as surely as the ghosts of his past. He rose to his feet, his long black hair damp with sweat, his muscles taut with decision. "Show me," he said. The women exchanged a glance, startled, then nodded. One pointed toward a narrow passage veiled in dripping vines and torch smoke. The air that seeped from it was colder, fouler, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of blood and damp earth. The warrior moved first, silent and deliberate, every step carrying him further into the darkness. The women followed close behind, their bare feet whispering against the stone. The tunnel wound downward, the ceiling lowering until jagged rock nearly scraped his hair. Strange markings were carved into the wall, symbols of beasts, spirals, and eyes gouged deep into the stone, their meaning long forgotten. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to pulse with menace. A dull glow flickered ahead. The warrior halted, raising a hand for silence. He pressed himself against the wall, peering around the bend. What he saw turned his stomach. A vast chamber yawned before him, its ceiling lost in shadows, the walls lined with iron cages hammered into stone. Inside them huddled men, women, and children, dozens of them, their eyes wide and hollow, their bodies thin and bruised. Some clutched each other for warmth. Others lay still, unmoving. The air reeked of despair and sweat, the silence broken. Only by occasional sobs died at the far end of the chamber. More men stood guard, half a dozen, armed with rifles and blades. They laughed among themselves, gambling with dice on a crate, their cruelty casual, as though the suffering around them was nothing more than scenery. The women behind the warrior gasped softly, their hands clapping over their mouths to silence. Their cries, one whispered, trembling, "This is what they do. They sell them, take them across the border. None ever come back." The warrior's jaw clenched. His eyes swept the chamber, every muscle in his body screaming to act. But 6 armed men were not 3 drunken captors. He had no spear, no rifle, only his fists, his strength, his will. Still, he felt the old fire burning in him, hotter with every heartbeat. One of the prisoners, a boy no older than 10, lifted his head. His hollow eyes met the warrior's across the shadows. And though the child was gaunt and broken, there was something in his gaze, hope, faint but flickering. The warrior knew then. He could not turn back. He gestured for the women to stay hidden, his hand firm, commanding. Then, drawing in a deep breath, he stepped into the chamber. The guards looked up, startled. One of them barked a laugh. "Well, look what the cave dragged in." Another hero. They rose to their feet, rifles gleaming in the torchlight. The warrior's voice was steady, deep as the stone around them. "Let them go." Laughter rolled through the chamber, cruel and echoing. The prisoners shrank back in fear, their chains rattling softly. One of the guards spat onto the ground. "You're outnumbered, savage. Best turn around before you get carved into the rock like the rest." The warrior stood tall, the torchlight glinting off his tribal jewelry, his chest rising. Like the breath of a storm, he was unarmed, yes. Outnumbered, yes. But in his eyes burned something none of them could name, a fire that had slept for years but now roared awake. "Then carve me," he said, his voice like stone breaking. The chamber went still. The men gripped their rifles tighter. The prisoners leaned forward, hope and fear mingling in their hollow gazes. The storm was about to break. The cave shuddered with echoes of footsteps as more men poured in from the winding passageways, drawn by the sounds of struggle. Their boots scraped over damp stone, the air carrying the metallic stench of gunpowder and sweat. Torches guttered. In their sconces, flames bending as if recoiling from the violence about to unfold. Kalen, the warrior who had sworn never again to raise his spear, stood alone against them, his chest bare, muscles taut as a bowstring. The flickering light traced the sharp angles of his face, shadows pooling beneath his cheekbones, his long black hair clinging damply to his shoulders. The tribal jewelry that draped across him rattled faintly, bone and turquoise catching the fire like tiny sparks of lightning. The outlaws barked orders to one another. There were 5 now, each armed with pistols or blades, their faces hard, weathered by sun and cruelty. They moved with confidence, as men accustomed to breaking others, their laughter thick with malice as they caught sight of the 2 women still bound by ropes near the wall. "You think you can walk in here and play hero?" One sneered, lifting his revolver. His voice dripped contempt, but Kalen could smell the tremor of fear beneath it. The man's hands twitched too quickly for someone truly confident. Kalen's jaw tightened. He could feel the cave breathing, hear the slow drip of water from stalactites above, and beneath it all the pounding of his own heart. For years he had buried this part of himself, the warrior's spirit. Yet here it was, alive again, rushing through his veins with fire and iron. "I do not play," Kalen said, voice low, steady. The words carried across the cavern, soft but slicing, like the edge of his spear. The nearest outlaw lunged first, reckless. Kalen pivoted, spear flashing, the butt of it slamming into the man's ribs. The sound cracked through the chamber, like a felled branch. The outlaw folded, gasping, collapsing at Kellen's feet. Before his body hit the stone, another rushed him with a knife. Kalen spun, hair whipping, spear glinting in the torchlight. The blade of the spear caught the knife wielder's wrist, sending the weapon clattering across the floor. The outlaw cursed, clutching his hand, but Kalen didn't pause. His elbow struck the man's jaw, dropping him with a dull thud. The remaining 3 men faltered. Their eyes darted to one another, torn between anger and fear. The leader, a tall man with scars running like rivers down his cheek, snarled and cocked his pistol. "Shoot him!" he roared. But in the confined space of the cave, gunfire was as dangerous to friend as foe. They hesitated, and that heartbeat of doubt was all Kalen needed. He surged forward, spear whistling, the stone beneath his bare feet slick with moisture. He struck with precision, disarming one man, sweeping another's legs. Moving as if guided by instincts older than the cave itself, the leader finally fired. The pistol's roar shook the cavern, torches flickering violently. A bullet sparked against the stone wall, fragments flying dangerously close to the bound women. They screamed, their voices echoing against the rock, fear and desperation mingling. Kalen did not falter. He closed the distance between him and the leader, spear thrusting upward. With a sudden twist, he knocked the pistol from the man's grip. It clattered across the ground, spinning into the shadows. The leader drew a knife in desperation, slashing wildly. Kalen caught the man's arm, the blade stopping inches from his chest. The 2 locked eyes, one filled with greed and cruelty, the other with an unyielding fire born of loss and memory. Slowly, Kalen overpowered him, his muscles straining, then forced the man to the ground with a roar that echoed like thunder through the cavern. The cave went still. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the scent of iron. The remaining outlaws writhed on the ground, moaning, broken. The leader, pinned beneath Kellen's knee, spat blood and curses but could not rise. Kellen's gaze flicked to the women. Their eyes, wide with both terror and hope, locked on him. Ropes still bound their wrists, their faces pale in the torchlight. They had been waiting for death or worse, and here stood the man who had defied it. Kalen released the leader, leaving him gasping in the dirt. He rose slowly, chest heaving, his silhouette framed by the wavering torch flames. He strode toward the women, each step deliberate, the spear still gripped in his hand. As he knelt beside them, the world seemed to shrink to just their eyes, pleading, desperate, alive. His calloused fingers worked at the ropes, loosening the knots. The women's breaths came in sharp gasps, their skin marked red where the bonds had dug too deep. "You're safe now," Kalen said quietly, but inside he knew safety was fragile. The cave had more shadows, and shadows often held secrets. And somewhere deeper within, he could feel it, the stirring of something darker. The fight was not over. Asterisk. Asterisk. The echoes of the clash faded into the cavern until only the crackle of torches and the shallow breaths of the wounded filled the silence. The floor was littered with spent shells, broken blades, and bodies sprawled like discarded shadows. The jungle cave, once alive with the cruel voices of outlaws, now stood as a tomb for their violence. In the middle of it all stood the warrior. His chest rose and fell like a great drum, sweat glistening against bronze skin. His spear, chipped and blood-stained, dangled loosely in his hand. Long black hair fell over his shoulders in tangled strands, catching the dull flicker of firelight. For the first time since lifting his weapon again, silence gave him space to feel his arms heavy with exhaustion, his soul trembling under the weight of memory. The two women remained bound near the cavern wall, their dresses soaked from the damp stone and their wrists rubbed raw by coarse rope. They had watched the storm of violence in disbelief, not knowing whether this half-naked warrior had appeared as savior or executioner. Now, as he staggered toward them, their fear met with something else, a fragile spark of hope. The older of the two spoke first, her voice hoarse from screaming during the fight. "Please, cut us free." The warrior's jaw tightened. He dropped his spear to the ground with a hollow clang, then crouched beside them. With a blade pulled from his belt, he sliced through the ropes with swift, deliberate motions. The fibers snapped apart and both women gasped, clutching their freed wrists as though they couldn't believe they were real again. "You are safe," he said at last, his voice low and deep, carrying both comfort and command. But even as he said it, the warrior's eyes darted to the dark corridors of the cave. Safe was a word he had not trusted in years. Safe was a lie he had told his people once, only for them to fall under the gunfire of men much like these outlaws. His heart clenched, the memory surfacing unbidden, raw as the day it was carved into his soul. He had buried his spear after that massacre, sworn never to wield it again. And yet here he stood, weapon in hand, blood on his body, rescuing strangers from the same kind of men. One of the women, younger, no more than 30, laid a trembling hand on his forearm. They would have killed us, or worse. "Who are you?" For a long moment he did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the cave's far wall, where ancient carvings traced symbols of a forgotten time. Finally he said, "I was a man who walked away from war. But tonight the spirits demanded I return." The women exchanged a glance, uncertainty mingling with gratitude. The older one whispered, "Then the spirits chose well." The warrior rose to his full height, his silhouette stretching across the cavern wall, strong and unyielding even in his weariness. He turned his ear to the tunnels, listening. Beyond the smoke and shadows, he thought he heard faint footsteps, echoing deeper in the mountain. His hand reached instinctively for his spear. "They are not all gone," he muttered. The women stiffened, clutching each other. The warrior paced to the cave's mouth, where vines draped like curtains against the humid night. The jungle outside was alive with the hum of insects and the cries of unseen creatures. The moon spilled through the leaves, silver against the blood on his chest. He took a long breath, and in it carried both the pain of his past and the resolve of his present. No longer could he claim to be only a man of silence, hiding in shadows. No longer could he bury his spear. He had been summoned back, not for himself, but for those who still needed someone to fight. Turning back to the women, he spoke with a clarity that filled the cavern like a drumbeat. "I will see you safe through this jungle. But know this, my path is not yet done. The men who took you, they are part of something greater. I will not rest until the darkness that hides in these caves is destroyed." The women, still trembling, nodded. They believed him not because of his words alone, but because of the fire in his eyes. The warrior bent, lifted his spear once more, and with it lifted his vow. The cave seemed to shudder with the weight of it, as if the stone walls themselves bore witness. For the first time in years, he did not walk away. He walked forward. The silence after battle was deafening. Only the faint crackle of torches and the drip of water from the cavern ceiling remained, echoing against stone walls that had once roared with the clash of steel and screams of dying men. The warrior stood motionless, chest rising and falling, his spear resting heavy in his grip. Blood, his and others, ran down his bronze skin in crimson trails, glinting in the firelight. His long black hair clung to his shoulders, damp with sweat, but his eyes burned with the same ferocity that had carried him through every strike. The two women, their wrists raw from rope burns, leaned against the wall, watching him with a mix of awe and disbelief. Hours ago, they had been nothing but captives, voices silenced, dignity stripped away. Now, because of him, they were alive. One of them, her voice trembling, whispered, "Who are you?" The warrior turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed he might walk away without answering. His life had been one of silence, of distance, of burying his past so deeply that even his name was dust. But the question lingered, heavier than the stone walls around them. He knelt, driving the spear into the dirt floor, and bowed his head. "I was once called Taeon," he said at last, voice rough like gravel. "But the world buried that name when I chose to leave it all behind." The women exchanged glances, sensing the weight in his words. Before he could say more, a low rumble shook the ground beneath them. Dust fell from the ceiling, torches flickered, and the cavern moaned like a wounded beast. The jungle above was alive with movement, branches snapping, leaves hissing as if an army moved in unison. "They're not finished," Taeon muttered, rising to his full height. His broad shoulders tightened, his jaw set. He had killed the men in this cave, but there were more mercenaries, hunters, men who served the same darkness that had stolen these women from the world. And they were coming. The women stiffened with fear. "We'll never make it out," one said. Clutching the other's arm, Taeon stepped closer, crouched before them, and for the first time since their paths crossed, his gaze softened. "You will," he said firmly. "I swear it. The jungle may devour the weak, but it bows to those who carry fire in their spirit. And tonight that fire is mine to wield." He pulled a dagger from his belt and cut strips from his own leather bracers, wrapping their wounds with steady hands. Then he gave them a choice. "If you run now, you may find the river by dawn. Follow its song, and you'll see the sunrise. Or stay and fight with me." The women hesitated, fear etched into their faces, but beneath it was something else, resolve. They had seen him fight, seen him rise like a storm in the cavern. To walk away from him now would mean surrendering that strength, surrendering hope itself. "We stay," the braver of the two said, voice shaking but firm. Taeon nodded once. A flicker of pride touched his stern features. The jungle roared outside as shadows began to form at the cavern's mouth. Torches bobbed in the distance, voices barked orders, steel clinked. They were coming fast. Taeon lifted his spear, the bone jewelry on his arms rattling faintly in the firelight. He stepped forward, planting himself between the women and the Faos. Cave's entrance like a living wall of muscle and fury. The women clutched rocks and broken weapons scattered on the ground, ready to defend themselves if it came to it. As the first outlaw stepped into the glow, his sneer froze at the sight before him. The towering warrior, bare chest scarred but unbroken, spear gleaming in firelight, eyes blazing like twin embers. For a heartbeat, even evil hesitated. Taeon's voice thundered through the cavern, not just to the enemies before him, but to the spirits of the jungle, to the ghosts of his ancestors, and to the past he had long buried. "You took their freedom. You hunted innocence. Tonight, I take back what was stolen." And with a roar, he charged. The cave erupted again into chaos, spear against steel, cries against silence, fire against darkness. The women, once captives, became fighters at his side, striking with desperate courage. Each blow Taeon delivered was not just survival, but redemption. He was no longer the man who hid from his past, he was the warrior reborn. By dawn, the jungle fell silent once more. Smoke rose in thin trails through the canopy, birds cautiously returning to song. The cave, once a tomb, had become a sanctuary. Women stood at the mouth of the cavern, staring at the horizon painted in gold and crimson. Behind them, Taian emerged slowly, his body battered, his spear cracked, but his spirit unbroken. He looked to the rising sun, then to them. "Your journey begins here," he said softly. "Mine begins again." And as the first light touched, his face, the warrior shirtless, scarred, adorned in the tribal jewelry of his people, stepped into the jungle not as a ghost of the past, but as a protector reborn.